Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me on the Gift of Need podcast. I'm Jude DiMeglio Trang. I'm an author and observer of the many places where human need shows up in our society. This podcast seeks to address the overlooked power of need and also how it shapes our behavior, our relationships, and society. And it's born from the belief that our needs are not burdens, but are opportunities and gifts. My guest today is Dr. Molly Worthen. I am so excited and thrilled that she made time to be on the podcast with me today. Welcome, Molly.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Molly is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and also a freelance journalist. She teaches courses on North American religion and politics, global Christianity, and the history of ideas. She writes on these themes for the New York Times and has contributed to the New Yorker, Slate, the American Prospect, Foreign Policy, and many other publications. So, Molly, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
I grew up in a town called Glen Ellen, Illinois, which is about 20 miles west of Chicago. And my parents humored my disorganized but enthusiastic intellectual interests. I was, I guess, broadly interested in history and learning all the weird things that humans have done over time. And those interests maybe took a more solidified form when I got to university and in the process of taking classes in history and philosophy and politics. And I think meeting a wider range of people from different backgrounds, I became really interested in religion. I had not grown up with any particular religious tradition, but it became clear to me that for a huge proportion of our species, religion is the frame through which they make a whole lot of sense of reality. And if I wanted to understand people, I needed to study religion. I think too, I was aware, even at the time as an undergraduate, that I was feeling a bit envious of people I was meeting who were rooted firmly in some religious community and had a set of answers, or at least a way of approaching the big metaphysical meaning questions. And I didn't really have that, but I didn't know, not having grown up in any faith tradition, all of the practices and experiences that come with that for people who grew up in it were really foreign to me. And the only way I knew to approach it was in the intellectual path, taking classes and studying and reading books. And I got interested too in spending time with people in religious communities. I had a formative summer research project after my sophomore year, where I went and lived in near a community of Russian Orthodox Old Believers in rural north central Alberta in Canada. And they're a pretty isolated community who have a lot of purity rules regarding outsiders. And I spent, several weeks slowly making some contacts in the community among girls my age and winning the trust of enough people to, be able to go to church services and help, clean the chickens after they were slaughtered and this sort of thing. And it was my first attempt to really get as close as possible to seeing the world through the lens of a group of people very different from myself. And I fell in love with that as a thing to do, whether it's through journalism or learning history and teaching and writing. And so that's kind of the direction I've taken. Because of my interests in, being able to write for a broader audience, I shifted my focus a bit from Russian Orthodoxy to studying contemporary American religion in graduate school. And since finishing my PhD, I have primarily been a, sort of ordinary history professor, but I do as much journalism as I can on the side because I love having the excuse to talk to interesting people and ask them about how they see the world.
Well, I'm with you right there. That's part of the fun of doing this podcast is I'm a highly curious person, much to the chagrin of my close family members and friends because I always want to know more. But it is so interesting. I do find it fascinating. Humans are very fascinating. And well, we're going to take off from that and say that today we're going to be discussing Molly's newest book titled Spellbound: How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump, and how our human need for meaningful life can be taken advantage of by people with the power of charisma. So, as a professor of history, then, what led you to write about this interesting word, charisma?
This is about 10 years ago, 2016 or so, and it was really the confluence of two thoughts I was having. One was, I think like a lot of Americans, I was trying to understand our political landscape and the highly polarized reactions that Americans had. I mean, specifically to Donald Trump, but more broadly, how one half of the country could have just such a different reaction to a particular leader, maybe feel highly attracted and persuaded by this person, while another large swath of the country would have the opposite reaction, a reaction of revulsion. And what's going on there that accounts for that totally disparate set of reactions? And then there was this sort of broader problem that I had been mulling over, that I think faces those of us who are interested in religion, journalists, scholars, people who are in the business of kind of trying to make sense of religion in the landscape of the modern West. For a couple of generations at least, I think people who are focused on religion have relied a great deal on poll numbers to tell them something about the status of Westerners' beliefs and how they make sense of the world, their views of matters of ultimate concern. So every year we hear a lot about declining rates of church attendance. What do people say when a pollster calls them up and asks, do you believe in God? Do you identify with a particular religious tradition? These statistics have been useful for a long time as kind of shorthand. And it's been assumed that they give us some sense of kind of the pulse of what's happening. And while there have been interesting exceptions lately, and maybe we can talk about that, some spikes in some demographic groups and interest in practice of religion. In general, the story, since the late 1960s has been one of slow, steady decline. But I guess my conviction has been, since the beginning of my career as a student of religion, that humans are, in a pretty fundamental way, religious beings. By that I mean we are wired to crave a way to connect our individual story to some bigger narrative of transcendent meaning that lends significance to our struggles and our suffering. And I think we are wired with the impulse to worship, to set some entity or cause apart from ordinary life as holy and orient ourselves toward it. And just because that religious impulse is not landing as often as it once did in institutions of traditional worship on weekends, to me, it's a mistake to conclude that the impulse is evaporating. I think it's just landing elsewhere. So my hypothesis going into the research for this book was perhaps one place that impulse is landing is in the relationship between some leaders and their followers. And so I was trying to kind of investigate that over the expanse of American history since roughly European contact to the present.
And so that's where this charisma, this magnetism that you're writing about came into the picture for you. And why don't you define what you mean by charisma and how its meaning has evolved from its religious origins to the sociological meaning that we recognize in American politics and culture today?
This is part of what makes it so interesting to me. I think it's a term we use frequently, but often rather vaguely, and it's not always clear what we mean. I am interested in charisma in both senses, in the original New Testament sense and in the more colloquial sense that we use to mean something in the vicinity of the allure that leaders have in the political realm. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But originally, charisma it's a Greek word, and it evolved from the older word charis in ancient Greek, meaning gift from the gods, supernatural grace. In the New Testament, Paul primarily takes that word and makes it charisma. And in the context of the Bible, it has slightly different meanings in different contexts. It generally means God's supernatural gift, gracious gift to his people. So it can mean the kind of general gift of salvation to believers. That's what it means mostly in the letter to the Romans. In other contexts, like 1 Corinthians, Paul is talking about specific supernatural gifts, the gifts of speaking in tongues, prophecy, healing, things like this. For a long time, for 1900 years, really, the word stayed squarely in the zone of biblical studies, theology, church history, until around the turn of the 20th century, the German sociologist Max Weber borrowed the word. He had encountered it, listening to lectures on church history, and he repurposed it in his burgeoning new discipline of what we would now call, the modern social sciences, because I think he saw that there was an ineffable dynamic between leaders and followers that he wanted a new tool to describe. And so he's the one who's really responsible for bequeathing it to us. It kind of found its way from academic circles into popular journalism and conversations about politics to describe a form of authority that is distinct from the authority that comes from having a big military or your position in an institution or the legitimacy a leader might derive from long-standing tradition. Charismatic authority hinges on followers' conviction that this leader has a supernatural set of powers or achievements. Now, I say that, and I think that we still do very much, a lot of us are riffing off of Weber without realizing it. But I think the way people actually use the term in conversation is often all over the place. And I'll tell you, when I started my research on this, I definitely was in a muddle, and I confused charisma, I think, with charm. I confused it with the kind of someone just being really good at working the room at a cocktail party. And I thought in writing this book, I would be writing about a lot of really like interpersonally attractive people. Right. I thought I'd be writing about people who are all excellent public speakers and really good looking and lots of sex appeal, and that was my vague guess. And in reality, that was occasionally true, but much more in the breach than in the broader pattern. And in fact, I found that I was writing about figures who were very polarizing. Maybe some people found them to be compelling public speakers, but just as many, usually more, found them to be kind of revolting, totally unpersuasive, completely alienating. And I realized that the heart of charisma is a bit different from how Weber laid it out. And it's certainly not charm and it's not celebrity, but rather the heart of it is a particular kind of storytelling. It's an ability to invite followers into a new narrative of what their world means and their role in it. A story that is more compelling to them than the other stories currently on offer in their culture. And I think our reaction to a leader, whether we find that leader deeply magnetic or totally repulsive, has everything to do with our relationship to his or her story. Is the leader giving us an attractive role, making us a hero? Or is he casting us as a villain or ignoring us entirely? That that question really determines our relationship to the person. So the book tells the story of the kind of intertwined nature of really the history of charisma in that original New Testament sense, because that has always been and remains a important way in which humans seek a transcendent connection, and how that's intertwined with the story of charisma in the sense of politics and this storytelling that happens in both politics and religion.
That is so fascinating. And reading your book, and well, we'll probably discuss maybe a little bit more in the second half of this podcast about some of the spiritual leaders and things. It's just, oh, I don't know. It's startling, I guess, and very revealing. And religious aspect of charisma are inextricably intertwined in the West, particularly in America. But I'd like to focus on the political aspect in particular now. You wrote, quote, "If the history of charismatic leaders teaches us anything, it is that observers who are trying to understand a leader's relationship with his followers make a mistake if they focus on the cogency of his arguments, the soundness of his factual claims, or the attractiveness of his personality. They conjure for millions of Americans the feeling that someone powerful saw them and heard them and spoke for them." That's that relationship thing that you're talking about. So, can you give us an example of a charismatic political figure or two from history who displayed a type of this magnetism, this charisma that you write about?
I think it's important to keep in mind that, often when we use the term charisma, it has a real a moral connotation. Sometimes we use it as shorthand for manipulation. Other times when we call a leader charismatic, we mean it as a compliment. And either way, there's a kind of judgment embedded in it. And I want to stress that, to me, charisma in and of itself is morally neutral. And it can play a role in history that I think we might say advances moral progress, or it can do the opposite. And so to call charisma a kind of storytelling, I don't want to imply that it is always a form of fabrication, right? Because stories are just how we organize, how we make sense of the world. And so a leader may be simply presenting a more compelling way of organizing the facts of the world into a story with a new kind of meaning, or revealing new information that followers didn't have. It can also be the case that the leader is kind of confecting, a counterfactual world. So both are true. But I would say we can learn a lot by thinking about some of the famous figures in American history this way. I mean, an obvious example of a figure who in whose case I think charisma is not at all a negative thing would be Martin Luther King. I mean, I think so much of his power lay in presenting a new narrative of America. I mean, drawing very profoundly on his Christian framework, to convince a huge number of Americans who had simply not been activated before, had not seen the possibility for change, to convince them that in fact they had a central role to play. And his genius, and this is true of all the leaders that I write about, lay in responding with great agility, I think, to the desires and anxieties of his age. I divide American history into 5 kind of epochs, and in each period, a certain style of charismatic storytelling is particularly compelling. And often it's the case that charismatic leaders are defining themselves really against institutions, against elites. That's a very potent strand in American history. But the kind of apex of Martin Luther King's career, unfolds in the 1950s and 60s, which is the period I call the age of the experts. And it is this kind of anomalous period in American history when there is a real hunger for a very rationalistic style of communication, relative to other periods in American history, a confidence in expertise associated with institutions. And certainly, in King's case, he faced particular pressure to win over white elites, skeptical, more conservative African Americans who were increasingly nervous about more politically radical leaders, and the emerging Black Power movement. And so in this context, he was very agile at playing the expert, drawing on his PhD, his kind of background in this upper middle class, very educated Black Baptist milieu, to convey this, almost sort of quasi-professorial persona when the moment called for it. But he could pivot and into really the Black prophetic tradition when that was really the thing that would connect with his audience and invite them into a story and a vision of his authority and their role in it. So I think this lens of charismatic storytelling and what that means in each particular era, it can help us see leaders who are familiar to us, we think, in a new light, and help us connect them to kind of other figures that we might not all put together in one story. So he's one example.
Did we have any in American history, any Hitler, Mussolini, Napoleon style leaders that in politics that you go into in the book?
Even though those leaders that you just named are not U.S. figures, they are so important for understanding the American history of charismatic leadership. That era I was just talking about, the era of the experts, it's the post-war era. And it really, the whole culture is in a kind of state of post-traumatic stress disorder in the wake of Hitler. And Hitler is the most egregious of this, whole set of fascist demagogues, who come to power in the 30s and 40s. And in the wake of that, and the atrocities that they committed, of course, most particularly the Holocaust, at really so many levels of American society, in the West generally, I guess you might say, there is this sense that, okay, if that's what charismatic leadership is, if it results in Hitler, and that's how easy it is to manipulate apparently rational humans to support this murderous nihilist vision, well then, charisma has no place in modern Western democracy. And we've got to swing in the other direction and trust technocrats and experts. And charismatic demagoguery, that's a thing that, social scientists continued to write about it and spot it and analyze it in the newly independent countries in the global South, especially in Africa. And I think it reflects a certain cultural chauvinism and condescension, a sense that, following a charismatic leader, that's something that more primitive people do, who, they're coming out of a pre-modern religious worldview and they can't quite let go of that yet. And it's a phase that the modern West has moved out of. Which I think created a certain blindness to the persistent hunger that Americans and other Westerners continue to have for leaders who saw that it is never enough to just present your constituents with the calculations of policy and PowerPoint slides, but there has to be a narrative that puts it all in a transcendent context. So while I don't think, scanning over American history, we have not had a figure of the scale of a Napoleon or a Hitler. I think certainly that hunger for kind of black and white clarity, and how appealing it is to feel yourself to be in a story in which you are on the side of the heroes and you know who the villains are, and a sense that therefore you have some agency. You have a way of seeing the chaos of that's unfolding, that hits us whenever we read the newspaper, and seeing how you can navigate it day to day, but you aren't responsible for the whole thing working out in the end. You can kind of pass that responsibility off to a larger power. You get both. You get that sense of freedom and control, but ultimately the buck stops with a more powerful figure. That is such an appealing bargain. And I think the human desire for that has certainly persisted, even if we flatter ourselves to think, well, we would it would never manifest in a figure of that world historical fearsomeness like Hitler.
Oh boy. Well, in that light, I would like to discuss Christendom. And I know when you do any research on the word Christendom, most of the time it's used in the positive sense of it relating to the move of Christianity. To me, it's a very different word. And due to the politicization of Christianity in the past several decades, along with other religions, many of us who follow Jesus Christ and separate being a Christian from attempts at Christendom or Christianity as a political movement are concerned. And there's people like the guy Doug Wilson, who founded Christ Kirk in Idaho. So they're a self-proclaimed Christian nationalist, founded his own denomination and school and all of that. And now they've planted a church just a few blocks away from the Capitol, with some of the people in the administration attending it. And the disconcerting part, many disconcerting parts, they promote a patriarchal theology. They've actually aired videos discussing why women should not have the right to vote. And he has said he wants, quote, a Christian town, a Christian nation, and a Christian world, end of quote. I see this as trying to establish Christendom. And on the surface, I understand why this sounds appealing to Christians in America who feel that many of the Judeo-Christian values that American society was founded on have disappeared. Yet, I think they do not understand what they're really asking for: imposed adherence to laws and statutes that will ultimately take away the very freedoms that we have to choose to follow our consciences, especially in the areas of how we practice our faith, things like free speech, the right to assemble, the right to worship as we see fit. And again, this ties in with those paradoxes you're talking about. So as a historian, I'd be interested in knowing what your thoughts are on the idea of Christendom, how it relates to American history and this moment in time and this movement towards Christian nationalism.
Wow, that's a daunting question.
It's a big subject.
Yeah, I guess it seems to me that Christianity, since the origins of the faith, has always had a complex relationship with worldly power. And I think the main thrust of Jesus's message is clearly a countercultural, counter-imperial message of deep caution, and one that calls his followers to interrogate any practical alliance they may make with worldly power. But on the other hand, the gospel is also a message that has consequences for how we order our lives here and now. And I think any a person of a with consistent commitments to whatever their religious faith is, not just Christianity, is reasonable in bringing those commitments to bear on how they think about politics, right? So, I do sometimes think that secular people posit a kind of hard line between faith commitments and the political sphere that is it just doesn't make any sense, and shows a certain lack of self-awareness, because people who do not consider themselves religious absolutely still have commitments to metaphysical principles. Whether it's universal human rights or particular view of the essence of sexuality, what freedom consists in, right? And they bring those to bear. So I think it's important to see that we're all doing that all the time, and also to see that both, in my view, conservative Christians and liberal secular folks tend to misconstrue and I romanticize certain aspects of our own past. And I see this a lot in the debates over the founding fathers. While it's certainly true that they had a high view of the freedom of conscience, they did not want the United States to have an established church of the kind that really is the cornerstone of Christendom in the European sense. This very explicit institutional bond between the state, the institutions of the state, and that of a privileged religion. They did not want that. On the other hand, they were all Protestants, if not church-going, then certainly in their kind of their paradigm for thinking about religion and the human individual, and what constitutes good morals. And they they disestablished the church and created what they saw as kind of a marketplace of religion, because they thought it would be good for churches. And they, given their fears about how the average ordinary American would govern himself in the absence of a monarch, right? They were elitists who were very worried about this. They saw strong churches as crucial for kind of moral ballast that would keep America in line, right? And so now you can. One can criticize that, for all kinds of reasons, but what you can't do is say that the modern religious right is totally wrong when they talk about these origin points, right?
Right.
But I think that you really identify the crux of the matter when you point to the coercive dimension of some of these expressions of what people call Christian nationalism. Exactly. And there is this tension in the origins of American Christianity, especially the Reformed Protestant tradition, which Doug Wilson comes out of. He's very Reformed, and it's if you do a head count, it's numerically a relatively small population. That's always been true, but one that has had disproportionate effect on our culture and our history, right? So this is, think of the Puritans, right? There is on the one hand this legacy of fleeing the coercion of the Church of England and wanting to create a Christian community that honors the individual conscience, and that's the heart of the Reformation. But there is also, in kind of the DNA of American Christianity, this impulse to bring people into line with this particular view of sanctification, and this discomfort with the diversity that was even present in the colonial period. So my point is simply that tension is deep in our history, and I think that one development that gives me hope is that we are seeing this incredible demographic diversification of American Christianity, the browning of Christianity, if you want to call it that. And I think with the rising proportion of Christians, Catholic and Protestant, who come from backgrounds that are not narrowly American and perhaps not even Western, they are equipped to question in all kinds of ways some of the assumptions about, the political policies that are to follow directly from Christian commitments. Not always, by the way, in a manner that would please secular liberals. So, many of these, Hispanic or African descended Christians are very traditional on, say, matters of sexuality, but they have, a different take on economics, for example,
Right.
and they bring an important voice to some of these conversations about race.
Yeah.
So, I think all of that is important to keep in mind. Both the history and the future of Christianity complicates how we understand some of these conversations in this moment about what it means to be a quote unquote Christian country.
Right. And, in Christian nationalist desire to establish what I call Christendom in America, I think the majority of those people working so tirelessly toward their goal don't realize what is at stake for true Christianity. I think they are working from this foundational belief that we were a country based on Judeo-Christian moral principles, and a lot of those have gone right out of the window, especially in so many different ways. But I go back to Soren Kierkegaard's observation when he said, Christendom has done away with Christianity without being quite aware of it. And what he's referring to again is that organized, politicized, state-instituted Christianity, because it's Christendom, and it has done away with Christianity without being quite aware of it. And I think that's again, I don't think that many of my friends and relatives who would tend to lean towards Christian nationalism, I just, when we have conversations, I can see they just don't realize the danger involved in working towards a, quote, Christian nation, which in essence you can't have because Christians are people and nations aren't. Anyway, so, well, I want to, you wrote, the trends that experts describe as secularization do not indicate that Americans' deepest religious impulses are fading. This is what you just spoke about. A growing body of scholarship argues that Americans' desire for a source of existential meaning and tribal boundaries have simply migrated from religious affiliation to partisan political identity. Is this referring to the current dominating political climate of the zealot-like purges and fanatical interpretations of our Constitution? Or am I misreading that?
Well, I guess what I'm noticing is the widening band of political issues on which many Americans now say, you know what, compromise is just not possible on that, and your view on that issue is not a matter we discuss kind of calmly and perhaps both change our minds and meet in the middle, but rather your view on whatever it might be, healthcare, gun rights, school choice, that is shorthand for your existential moral worldview. And if it's at odds with mine, then forget it. We can't even have a conversation. So I think this is a very different political climate, even compared to the 1990s, which, it was the height of the culture wars. People in the 90s would have felt themselves to very much be in the culture wars. But there was a wider range of political issues on which both politicians and I think average Americans saw some room for, weren't highly charged, and that sense of electric charge has sort of spread out to encompass more issues. And I think more and more Americans derive their sense of identity from their political affiliations in a way that echoes the role that church affiliation played in previous generations.
Yeah, the polarization. A reviewer noted, Worthen pinpoints something else, something she sees as the key to the whole centuries-long drama of American charisma. Quote, the heart of charisma is the act of unveiling a hidden narrative. It invites followers to take up roles in a roster of morally stark characters and fold their lives into a plot line curving toward justice. this reviewer said, a charismatic leader asks their devotees, and he finishes your quote by saying, to find the strange freedom that comes from being swallowed by something much bigger than themselves. He says it is, at core, from your writing, a religious experience. So, which is basically what you've been saying. So, as we close, Molly, what do you see as the key to centuries-long drama in American charisma of this as a key, I guess? Can you boil it down to some like little bit part?
Well, if the heart of charisma is this ability to tell a certain kind of persuasive, transcendent story, and that storytelling ability speaks to what I'm saying is a universal human need, then I think it's important for individuals to become attuned to that dynamic in our own lives. And, when we find ourselves drawn to a particular leader, or feeling division with people in our lives because they are drawn toward a leader or a movement and we just don't get it, then perhaps it's useful to pose that question to ourselves. What is the story that this leader is telling? Why am I attracted to or repulsed by it? And the result of that process of interrogation may just affirm us and our reactions and our assessment of the situation, but it can be eye-opening, I think. And I think it can attune us to the difference between a charismatic leader who is a force for good and one whose presence is perhaps toxic. And I think the difference is that a healthy leader ought to be connecting us with a broader range of traditions, sources of information. He or she should be willing to submit to some system of checks and balances. So it's not that the story isn't of itself a nefarious thing, but it ought to be inviting us into an ecosystem of relationships and information that is balanced, where power is not too centralized.
Yep. Yes, I absolutely agree. Well, we're out of time for this part of discussing Spellbound. Thank you, Molly, for making the time to be with us today and talk about how the transcendent needs we each have need to be carefully guarded and treated with discernment, so they can become opportunities and gifts and meet the needs of individuals, communities, and society, which, of course, in turn brings joy and fulfillment to us all.
Thanks so much for having me.
You can purchase Molly's books at stores or online, and also you can check out her website for information and great articles at mollyworthen.com. The great music you're hearing was written and performed by Gabe Kubanda at Kubanda Music. You can find him on any streaming service. The engineer is Ray Ingegneri of 3rd Street Productions in Tucson, Arizona. Please consider following and rating this podcast and subscribing to my free Substack newsletter. And leave a comment or review. I would love to hear from you. Bye.